Hi, my name is Lola Oh, otherwise known as Lola Oh. I'm a Black British poet and I'm also a teacher in a secondary school. I've been writing poetry for as long as I can remember. There wasn't really a time that I wasn't writing. It's just that when I was younger, a lot of my poetry was childhood angst, and it was me using the only way I knew how to communicate my feelings, which was writing, and often it took a poetic form. And as I got older, I really started to investigate poetry and what it means to me and what it looks like and how it can work and function in my world. And I've just really enjoyed the process so much that I've never stopped doing it. My poetry often revolves around the things that frame my life, so my blackness and my womanhood, my identity as a black woman, as this is a lens through which I see the world. But I often also write a lot about childhood, innocence, family, and identity in general. Today I'm reading two poems, and the first is a poem that is concerned a lot with blackness, and it's told through the eyes of people who have lived and died for their blackness. And the second poem is concerned more with gentrification as a concept, an idea, and a process, what it looks like, how it works, and what it means to have a place that changes and have a culture that shifts and people that move over time. So my first poem is called Timestamp. The year is 1810. Black woman stands on the stage, a spectacle. To the crowd she remains unnamed, but to her mother she was known as Sarji. Where she stands, an amassing of colours and sound, the light dims as black woman begins to draw in crowd at the front. White man stands proud, shoulders back, legs wide, feet placed firmly on the ground. Between his fingers he clasps thick silver, the gag which silences young Sarji and the anchor to which she is bound. The year is 2014. Black boy walks to shop alone. To the neighbourhood watch he remains unnamed, but to his mother he was known as Trayvon. As he walks, the sunlight begins to dim. Black boy purchases juice and Skittles, not knowing the cycle will soon begin. Across the street, white man stands proud, shoulders back, legs wide, feet placed firmly on the ground. He knows that for his place to remain in history, then this is a target he must take down. For white man must be saviour, must be brave, must be proud. For black boy far too risky, far too dangerous, much too loud. So when black boy pulls out sweets, white man pulls out gun. Black boy puts up his hands in protest, but history's song has already been sung. The year is 2020. Another drawn-out assumption becomes another black boy drawn on the cover of service leaflet, becomes curtains drawn to close in daylight. This world that mother resides in must now only be occupied in darkness. So mother drawn to despair must sit through another fair trial drawn to close too early. Meanwhile, younger brother becomes drawn to violence against self, mimics his father's Yoruba accent to draw dark laughter from pale faces. He is too busy trying to remember how to draw strength, trying to forget the moment his brother drew last breath, trying to fight a system that refuses to name him, to understand that he is not a threat. Laying awake at night in his bed wondering, when will this cycle end? And my next poem that I'm going to read, so that was Timestamp, my next poem I'm going to read is Atlantis. After the sun dips down, you pull the shutters over her eyes for the last time. You know that tomorrow will mean exile, cast out into a sea of now foreign faces, so now your once upon a time home becomes cavity. The kind of gluten-free, dairy-free, low-carb, extra-large Starbucks sort of decay, the kind that moves in first down the street. where the dry cleaners was, then next door to the Trumans, then next door, then next door, then next, until one day it's yours, with a for sale sign pinned in the front garden, and you find yourself staring at an empty womb of a street, a road that no longer mothers you. It's taken you years for you to notice her changing, the patient unplaiting of histories, the combing out of cultures, an entire city snip, 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 snipped away. It had taken 3 years for your grandfather's store to detangle itself from his debt. 10 before coarse roots became akin to soil. She had been his legacy. Until one day... Thank you, that was Atlantis. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, and welcome to our last Wandsworth Poetry session, and hope you enjoy those readings. And with me today is Lola. Hello.
Hey, how are you?
All right, thank you very much, and thank you very much for your poems. I really enjoy listening to them.
Thank you.
And I just want to straight away ask about timestamp, because it is actually based on a real person.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. So it's based on a woman called Saatchi Baartman, who was a South African woman in the 1800s, if I'm correct. I don't know the exact date, actually. I can't remember the exact date, but essentially she was...
We will put some dates.
Yeah. She was taken from her tribe and worked in Europe as kind of almost a circus performer. And she was paraded around Europe, and she died a few years after she was taken to Europe. And when she died, her body parts were cut up and sold to museums, and they were held in French museums. The latest date of one of her body parts was until 2002. That was held in the museum. And when I read her story when I was in university, I was just so appalled and shocked by it, and it really inspired my poem Timestamp, and thinking about the treatment of black people throughout history and even today.
So obviously, being a black woman, is that a main theme of your poems, writing about your experiences as black women?
I think so. I think being a black woman informs everything that I write, because it's the lens through which I see the world. It's not necessarily always the most prominent theme in my poetry, but if you took all of my poems and looked at them, it would definitely come up again and again.
So what sort of other themes do you have?
I think...
do authors have themes?
I think it's not an intentional thing. I think I have a theme. I have themes, but it wasn't a chosen thing. It just so happened that when I looked across my poems, there were certain things that kept popping up. So I discuss a lot about identity, and I'm someone of African and Caribbean heritage, but I was born here in England, and I've grown up in England my whole life, and that was really confusing to navigate when I was younger, and figuring out who I was and kind of which parts of myself I wanted to represent, or I knew how to represent. So often I discuss kind of the complexities of identity. A lot of my poetry also talks about family and family roles, as well as kind of gender and that intersectionality between race and gender as well. So
do you think that you see yourself represented now in, not so much maybe literature, but in poetry specifically? And have you seen yourself represented in the past?
In the past, no. I loved writing since I was a child, but I didn't love poetry when I was younger the way I did now. I used it as a form of expression. And when I was younger, I did not know of a single black female poet at all. Now I know loads. One, because of social media and the internet has given me access to just, whether they're British, South African, American, I've been exposed to loads of black female poets, but also just being in the poetry scene myself, and other women that I've performed with, or other people who have similar stories or backgrounds to me, which is amazing to be in a community of people like me, but also then there's loads of other poets who aren't like me, and to see their perspective and how they bring different things to their writing as well.
So do you think there's more sort of accessibility and diversity in the poetry, obviously, at the moment?
I think so, but I think it depends on where you look, because I'm sure there's lots of people who don't know loads about poetry and probably still think poetry is kind of the canon and is dead old white men, and that's what poetry is to them. And I'm fortunate enough that I'm in a circle of poets in London, and so I know it's a lot more than that, but I don't think everyone sees poetry as that.
You see, to me, always is exactly what I always thought about the poetry. It's
Yeah.
full of dead white men.
Yeah.
And that's why it's not so awfully interesting as well.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I started looking into current and contemporary poetry that I discovered there's so much more than this. And why do you think that? So my thinking was, this is not for me because it's not about me. And I think the other thing is that people are scared of poetry.
Yeah.
That they just don't understand that. So do you have a take on that as well?
I agree with you. I think poetry was always put to us in schools through education, or however we might have been introduced, as this very like niche esoteric thing that, you know, you have to have been educated in a certain way to understand it or decipher it, and actually it's so much more than that. And I think what allowed me to realise that was looking at spoken word online, and I started watching Button Poetry, which is an American I'm not sure if it's Islam poetry, but it's an American poetry platform, and the poets on there were incredible, and the poems they were performing were not difficult to understand at all. Like they had nuance and they had energy, but I could relate. Even if it wasn't my story they were telling, I felt like I could relate and I could feel something through what they were sharing, and it just opened up that word poetry to me, and I saw that it could be so much more than what I was taught when I was younger. I don't think it is difficult to understand at all. Like, it isn't always these kind of weird nonsensical kind of stanzas and words. A lot of the time it is, you know, it uses our dialect, it uses our language, it uses our kind of phrases and our slang, whoever like the hour might be, whether that's black people or from another community, or as a young person, they share different things of our lives too.
And what you were talking about, the spoken word, it's not, basically it's another thing I wanted to ask you. So another thing I've discovered, it's so much variety within the poetry, because in the past the poetry for me was just basically stuff you read in books.
Yep.
And it's not so much that, is it?
No, there's I learned that there's like page poetry and stage poetry, and there's probably also loads of other poetries in between. Yeah,
that's a brilliant.
Yeah.
I've never seen it divided like that. I always used to like,
Yeah.
you know, poetry and spoken word, but that's brilliant. Stage poetry
and page poetry.
Page poetry.
Because like when I started writing poetry, I was writing to perform it, and I never really thought about, if this were on a page, what would it look like. But a lot of written poetry is all about kind of how is it put on the page. So when your readers read it, you know, how does that influence their experience of the poem? Whereas if you're performing it, you have a lot more freedom with your tone and your volume and your body language to influence what it is you're trying to say. And I think there's real artistry in either form that you take with poetry, because there's a lot of crafting involved in either one.
But you are a stage poet, basically.
I'm a stage poet. I cross over into page poetry sometimes. So I had 2 of my poems published in the Young Barbicans poetry anthology earlier this year, and that the focus heavily was, you know, how is my poetry going to look on the page and how am I laying out each poem. But my most comfortable form of poetry and how I came into poetry was performing it and being on the stage, and I love the experience of being in front of an audience and sharing my poems with them.
Is that how you started?
Yeah, I went to an open mic night. Me and my friend had been saying for years, like, let's do open mic, and we didn't. And then one day after university, we just went to an open mic night, and it was great. You had a minute and a half on stage to perform. I loved it, and I just kept doing it, and I haven't stopped since.
That's brilliant. And I just think that this is the way maybe to get more people engaged in poetry, because it's just a one short minute to perform a poem.
Yeah.
And it's not so and you get the firstly you get the instant reaction, which I think sort of helps when
Yes.
you see whether people enjoy what you're talking, they understand what you're talking about. And secondly, doesn't involve approaching publishers and you're trying to get somewhere into the written bit.
Yeah.
So do you have an aspiration to ever to try to create anthology, or are you just like committed to spoken word and that's that?
I think that's a good question. I think I would love to have a work, like a body of work, published at some point in my life. I think I don't know exactly how to do that, first of all, and I don't feel as though I have a cohesive unit of work that I want to publish at the moment. It isn't a big concern of mine, but it is an aspiration. And in fact, at the moment, I'm doing it's a written project because it's a digital exhibition, but I'm working with 6 black poets, and we are creating a project called Joy, which showcases the joy of young black people through poetry. So through written and performed poetry, because there'll be a recording of the poets. So I think at the moment my forte is still in the performance poetry, but there's still a lot more I want to do with the written form.
So do you have any like a projects and plan, as in like the wider scope? Do you want to just become a poet full time? How do you become a poet full time?
You know, it's amazing to me that exists as a job, and it's great because I have loads of friends who are full-time artists and they are poets. A lot of them are they are multidisciplined, so they write poetry, they might be a videographer or photographer, they might be a playwright, or just a writer alongside that. But it's shown me that it's possible to do that. Currently I'm a teacher in a secondary school, and I love working with young people. So I think my dream job, I don't have a title for it, but would be a mix between working with young people and using poetry to empower young people. So if I could perform and get young people to perform and write and showcase their work and feel empowered through their writing, that would be my dream profession, because that's the best of both worlds for me.
So the fact that you're a poet, does it have any impact on the way you work as well?
Not as much as I would like to. I think there's a lot of rigidity in the education system, which was partly why I wanted to be a teacher, because there was a lot of issues that I wanted to try and tackle in my own classroom. But I try and bring creativity to the classroom. I've taught a lot of my students how to do free writes and do other poetry kind of exercises, which they don't necessarily know that's what they're doing, but I teach them the kind of these creative means, or give them these creative tools that they can use to help them, hopefully, in their life or in their writing.
Yeah, I think this is very important. So personally, I think there's never enough poetry in schools, and this is strange to come from someone who, well, I enjoyed the poetry at school, but I never was a massive fan because of the way it was taught. And who so I'm someone who enjoyed poetry at school and then completely sort of forgot about the fact that poetry exists, and only recently discovered that it's actually quite a interesting part of the literature, the one that you don't necessarily have to understand what author wanted to say through this particular poem, but it leaves quite a lot for the interpretation as well.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that, you know, in schools people get to know that, you know, there is not one way to do the poetry. That's
the thing about poetry, and actually I was in a kind of a training session that we were discussing, like a seminar discussing poetry, and talking about how a lot of teachers sometimes are almost worried about teaching poetry because you feel like everything else in school you're taught with there is an answer, or there's a certain kind of answer you're supposed to give for a text or for a question, whereas poetry, and the joy of poetry is that it is very open-ended, and sometimes teaching that can be daunting because, you know, there is so much scope that actually it can feel quite overwhelming, but I think being able to embrace that and taking kind of just a range of different answers is a really cool way, because also you can just have like a great discussion with your kids, or they've told you something that you never considered about a poem, and you're like, oh yeah, like I do see it in that way, oh yeah, that is true about the poem.
No, I think that would be brilliant if we're talking more about the poetry in general. Good luck with your Joy project as well.
Thank you
and
very much.
If people want to know more about it and know more about yourself and more about the things you do, are you on social media much?
Yes, I'm only on Instagram at the moment, and my Instagram is _Lola Oh.
It would be linked.
Yes. And there's information about the Project Joy and how you can support the project and black artists through it, and just a little bit more about me, and my poetry is also there too.
Fantastic. So I hope that everyone is going to go and check it out.
Me too. Please do, guys.
No, I think we definitely need more of the sort of similar projects.
Yeah.
So yeah, good luck with that.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for agreeing to come and to come.
Thank you for having me.
Things got online. I suppose you come to the event as well,
Yeah.
anyway. So thank you for coming. Thank you for answering all my questions and having a little lovely chat. This is the last of our poetry events for the Wandsworth Poetry Week. I hope you enjoyed all of them. Please do check our poets. Obviously, all the previous videos, if you missed them, are on our Facebook page as well. So go and check them, like them, share them, support lovely poets that have performed for us, and hope you enjoyed, and hope you'll be able to organise something similar at some point in the near future. So that's all from us.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.